Well, I think we'll get started then. My name is John Denver from the University of San Francisco Law School. I'm going to moderate this panel. The title of it is Facts and Fantasies about Lawyers and Television.
Did you get your...
And our panelists, I'm going to introduce very briefly. Film bios are in the program. Michael Asimov, who's a professor at UCLA and a visitor here at Stanford. Phil Meyer, who's a professor at Vermont. David Ginsburg, who is the executive director of the UCLA Law, Media, and Policy program and also teaches there. And Shannon Mader, who practices law in Los Angeles with Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher. I'd like to facilitate a little bit by kind of bringing into relief the comments that I found most provocative from the presentations this morning. And it was basically is that I thought the kind of the law versus fantasy debate, the law side took quite a beating this morning. And that most of these people who are in the business seem to say basically is that law is not that large a part of the law franchise is what they talk about it. You need a little bit for verisimilitude and so people suspend belief and realize they're in a new situation. But most of these shows are about people, interesting people with problems, and problems that get resolved in a legal setting. And so in that situation, you would say basically it's kind of like the bar in Cheers. You know, you need the courtroom, basically, but you wouldn't say Cheers was a program about bars. You know, it's a program about friendship. So I invite you, as we go through your presentations today, is basically how you react to that kind of idea, basically. Is that really that law shows are really more character-based than they are law-based. So I think we'll start with Michael, and then we'll do David, and then Phil, and then Shannon.
Oh, well, thank you, John, and again, thanks to all of you for coming today. I hope everybody's having a good time and really learning a lot. But you're probably asking yourself right about now, why exactly are we having this conference? Why is this an academic conference about lawyers on television? I mean, we're all fans, right? Let's admit it, okay? I am, certainly. And we love to talk about our favorite TV lawyers and all of their ridiculous antics. But I needed a better excuse than that to sell this to Larry Kramer, who actually agreed to fund this conference. I mean, we're talking here about pop culture, right? We know that televised pop culture is strictly about making a profit. It's mostly designed to sell us goods and services, as someone said this morning, to fill those gaps between the commercials. It's mass entertainment. It's designed to be consumed and swiftly forgotten. Most of it is, let's face it, pure trash. Yet, it's interesting and important trash. So why should we care about lawyer TV anyway? I believe that's because television is the greatest teacher that's ever existed in the universe. Most of what people know or think they know about police or ER doctors or forensic scientists or cowboys or detective, yes, and law and lawyers as well, is drawn from what they've absorbed in the media, particularly television. Cognitive psychologists have described how we learn from television. They call this the cultivation effect. There's a huge body of work in the psychology literature about this. So just to vastly oversimplify it, our brain consists of vast numbers of files, or sometimes called schema. And we constantly add bits of information to each of these files all the time. And studies show that we're most likely to access this information, to store it and access it, if the bits of data are recent, frequently repeated, and vividly presented. And material drawn from television involving recurring themes that you see over and over again, and in very, very vivid form, of course, are perfect for this purpose. And we tend to forget the critical thing. They're just made-up stories. They're completely fictitious. And yet we forget that. As the psychologists say, we fail to source discount this material, and in fact, we treat it as truthful representations of reality. People just soak it up like millions of sponges. Now, Chuck Rosenberg disagrees with me on this point, as he said this morning, and he and I have discussed this many times, and we really do just disagree about how much people are learning from television. It's not the only place they learn, of course, but it's perhaps the most important. So, why is it that suspects arrested by the police in France claim their Miranda rights when Miranda doesn't exist in France? How is it that young German lawyers make motions in court that don't exist in Germany? Well, there's only one possible explanation of this, arising out of the worldwide penetration of American television. There are many other examples of this. One I'd like to mention is work that I did in conjunction with people in 5 other countries. And each of us took our first-year contract students on the very first day of law school, before they could be polluted by law school, and we asked them questions first about their opinion of the trustworthiness of lawyers. Now, as people have said this morning, the general consensus on that is that lawyers are scoundrels. They're the least popular, next to actors perhaps, of all of the professions in America. Only about 20% think that lawyers can be trusted. That's what the students said too. So I'm thinking, these are law students, right, on their first day of law school. Why are they entering this pack of thieves? But what I really wanted to know was, how did they answer that question? What was the basis of their knowledge? What did they find helpful in making judgments about the character of lawyers? That's what I really wanted to know. And and this was true in the United States and in the other 5 countries that we polled, all of which are exposed to American television, that 60% of the law students admitted that pop culture was helpful or very helpful to them in drawing their conclusions, right up there about equal to the news. So it's a bit of evidence, maybe methodologically questionable, but it goes along with this vast amount of research that already exists about the cultural impact of television. Now, in law and social science, we take an external view of law. We say law comes in from the outside. If law is what people think the law is, then the primary lawgiver in our society is pop culture about law and lawyers. These television shows and these movies are, in fact, the most important of all legal texts insofar as the general public is concerned. Well, turning to the sort of main subject of our conference, television lawyers. What are they like, these men and women who practice law in our living rooms? We have a 50-year arc dating from Perry Mason and the Defenders all the way through to the shows of the present. Now, unlike lawyers in the movies or in novels, actually the ones on television are often outstanding professionals and fine human beings, although perhaps a bit eccentric at times. I wish I could take you on a guided tour of the personalities of all these lawyers, but John Denver would cut me off very early in that presentation. So I want to focus on the most successful television lawyer in history, Perry Mason. Perry Mason is still available on cable. You can see him every day. You can buy the DVDs easily. In polls of the general public about the greatest American lawyers of all time, Perry Mason is near the top, ranked well ahead of real lawyers like Clarence Darrow, Johnny Cochran, Jerry Spencer, or John Marshall. Mason, played by the iconic Raymond Burr, always represented criminal defendants, and they were always innocent. The police and prosecutor always had the wrong person. Through investigation and brilliant cross-examination, Perry Mason always uncovered the truth. Of course, he was totally indifferent to business concerns and fees and had no personal life whatsoever. Now, the great thing about the Perry Mason television shows, of which there are 237, and in addition to about 24 made-for-TV movies, in which Raymond Burr also stars, although much older and much heavier, the great thing about it is, if you've seen one show, you've seen them all. Because in each case, the story is the same. So, Joelle, if we could just show a clip from Perry Mason that requires no introduction. So that's it.
to produce fingerprints, Davenport's fingerprints, from the inside of that trailer, would you swear on your oath that they were forgeries?
Well, he might have been in there once. I don't remember for sure.
Mr. Beckmeyer, isn't it a fact that Davenport was in your trailer on the day he died?
Oh, no.
Then where did he get the bacon and eggs? In that trailer.
It's a lie.
And where did he get the liquor? None was found in his room. You gave it to him, did you not? Generously spiked with arsenic?
I tell you, you're wrong.
Then answer this, Mr. Beckmeyer. If you did not kill Davenport, why did you dig that grave 2 days in advance?
I didn't.
What other reason could you have for buying a shovel from the Clary hardware store on that very same day?
Yeah. Well, the chump was asking for it. He never got tired of telling me how smart he was. He was going to disappear and leave his wife holding the bag. Everybody would wonder what happened to the body. It was such a great plan, I figured with a little help from me, it'd be perfect. Guess I was wrong, too.
Okay, so Perry Mason gets the guilty guy again. Now, these lawyers cringe at these ridiculously formulaic stories, but in fact, they've had an immense impact. What is it that Perry Mason is teaching to people and that accounts for the incredible cultural impact the character has had? Mostly that great lawyers use the adversary system to uncover absolute truth. Now, lawyers, of course, scoff at this. They deny their job is to discover absolute truth. Absolute truth, if such a thing even exists, is certainly unknowable. Lawyers speak instead of trial truth, right? Meaning that the truth is whatever the jury decides after a fair adversarial trial. But to the general public, absolute truth is what they crave from their justice system, not trial truth or not guilty because you didn't quite prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They want to know what really happened. And I think one of the reasons we're so addicted to the adversary system in this country, more than any other place in the world, is the grossly mistaken belief, spawned by Perry Mason and his many clones, that adversarial trials conducted by heroic, dedicated lawyers actually reveal absolute truth. It's enormously important cultural message. So perhaps the next landmark in the series is LA Law, which Phil Meyer is about to describe. There were lots of heroic and inspiring lawyers, in LA Law, along with some lovable rogues. But the show had a huge impact because it shows that law is practiced for profit. It also showed that law practice is glamorous, intellectually fascinating. You can make a lot of money fast and have an unlimited number of sexual partners. Needless to say, this caused a huge spike in law school applications. So today we have a vast assortment of legal shows, 6 or 7 this year alone. Sadly, some of them already canceled. We've made a new friend, Harriet Korn, known to all as Harry, who is played by the great actress Kathy Bates. She's a burned-out patent lawyer who opens a storefront law office in the Cincinnati ghetto with an idealistic young lawyer named Adam Branch. Like many of the lawyers who came before her, Harry takes on all comers as clients, even though she sometimes seems a bit out of her depth. But the thing I really like about the show is that her small firm is deeply enmeshed in the local black community. She hires former gang members and helps the local merchants. In one memorable show, she and her staff mediated a dispute between 2 street gangs that prevented a gang war from breaking out. So like Perry Mason, like Law and Order, Ally McBeal, The Practice, and so many other wonderful lawyer characters over the years, Harry teaches the public about law and lawyers. She teaches positive lessons. In an era where lawyers are the most despised profession in America, Harry teaches that lawyers are human beings like themselves, with the same dreams and the same troubles. That a lawyer can be a constructive and valued member of the community. That lawyers care deeply about their clients, and it isn't just a business. And you better get a dedicated and tenacious lawyer at your side like Perry or Harry when you're in deep trouble. So may we in the legal profession live up to the high standards set for us by TV lawyers. And may the TV lawyers continue to strut their stuff in the office and in the courtroom and keep right on teaching positive lessons about law and lawyers to generations yet unborn. Thank you.
Next, David Ginsburg is going to talk about a very influential TV show from the 60s, The Defenders. His talk is titled The Defenders, a breaking controversial ground.
The first thing I want to start out with is there's a show on right now called The Defenders, which is not the show I'm talking about, but because they were both on CBS and because CBS had an ownership position in the original show, I guess they just used the title. On Saturday evening, September 16th, 1961, nearly 50 years ago, a definitive boundary in the depiction of lawyers on television was crossed. The 125th episode of Perry Mason had just been broadcast, and a new program endeavoring to portray counsel, clients, and the conflicts with which they dealt, all in a fundamentally different way, had commenced its extraordinary and still acclaimed run. The Defenders was a show designed to be something innovative, serious but entertaining television, episodic drama delivered with conviction and resolve, a bridge between the then-past golden age of live anthology and the future of film series. From its outset, the audience was weaned from the expectation of a routine weekly murder case. The inaugural episode explored the principal defense of a physician charged with euthanizing a baby born with Down syndrome, and those who watched it, and I was among them, sensed that something compelling had arrived in the hour between Perry Mason and Gunsmoke, a show about lawyering as the liberal drama of controversy. But with every passing year, since it's not available on DVD, nor has it been in syndication in decades, there are fewer of us who remember The Defenders and how it changed the portrayals of lawyers on television. I am here to tell part of that story. On May 9th, 1961, Federal Communications Chair Newton Minow gave his debut address to the National Association of Broadcasters, and he included this remark, which reverberates today. He said, "I invite each of you to sit down in front of your television set when your station goes on the air and stay there for a day without a book, without a magazine, without a newspaper, without a profit and loss sheet, or a rating book to distract you. Keep your eyes glued to that set. I can assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland." Some observers have linked his speech, which also included comments about FCC licensure that TV executives took as threatening censorship, directly to the development of The Defenders as quality television at CBS. While it's true that Minow's agenda was instrumental in incentivizing dramas examining controversial issues in American society, the chronology does not permit that causal relationship, because months before, in 1960, the show had already been announced on the fall schedule for the fall 1961 season, with Herbert Brodkin producing and Reginald Rose writing the episodes. E.G. Marshall was cast as lawyer Lawrence Preston, and Robert Reed, later on the Brady Bunch, played his son and junior partner Ken. The father was a highly experienced lawyer, guided by a strong code of ethical obligation, but tempered by a sound familiarity with the pragmatics of law practice. The son, by contrast, was a neophyte, freshly schooled in the law, but guided more by instinct and passion. Just before the start of the 61-62 television season, the producers and CBS shared their ambitions. Rose drew a bright-line contrast between The Defenders and lawyer shows that had preceded it. The earlier shows, he said, were not about the law. Rather, they were entertaining mystery programs with the same elements to be found in a Western or a detective series. He wanted The Defenders to shatter a genre. A refreshing approach to the weekly shows, he said, will be the twist that Preston & Preston, the law firm of the two men, does not win every case it tries. When they lose a case and a client, a moral will be pointed out. Each will learn something about human nature and gain deeper instinct into his fellow man. Mr. Brodkin said that the purpose was to have a realistic portrayal of the legal profession at work, dealing with real people involved with everyday type problems. There will be none of the unconvincing last-minute detective work we just saw by attorneys, and none of the last-minute witness nonsense. Sorry, Michael.
No doubt about it.
The famed criminal practitioner Edward Bennett Williams noted in a thoughtful essay that when the Prestons lose, the episode is attacking legislation or decision that can be overruled only by courts higher than the one in which they practice, presenting a defeat as a moral victory. Rose's formula was a methodically constructed drama centered on a meaningful and engaging ethical or legal conflict, resolved often in an ambiguous climax. It's hard for us from today's vantage point, having watched year after year of shows as they exist today to imagine what it was like to watch those shows in 1961. Contrary to the general trend of filming in Los Angeles, it would be filmed in New York, with the city serving as a virtual character, much the same way that it does on Law & Order. Rose designed the dramatic core of the Defenders to reside in two parallel sets of opponents. The first, each case's attorneys, the Prestons against the prosecution or civil litigator, are common to all lawyer shows. But the fresh insight Rose brought to essaying the practice of law was the dynamic clash of the father and son partners. It is important to recognize that the two central characters of the Defenders are adversaries. They are bound together in professional as well as fraternal regard and affection for each other. But because they are different in age, experience, and their view of the world, their interplay can spark far more thinking and dispute than the blunt prosecution versus defense situation can generate. Rose's perspective was that the basic themes of the series are found and the key to the episodic story should be sought in the relationship between these two men, because they symbolize in a way the contradictory forces in mankind. The father exemplified a political man conducting the art of the possible, while the son diametrically opposed his father, passionately seeking the ideal, able to resist the kind of compromise that his father knows must be effective if any progress is to be made. Rose and Brodkin, with the support of CBS and at least the acquiescence of its sponsors, sought to revolutionize lawyer shows by presenting jurisprudence other than murder cases. They asserted the unabashed perspective of liberalism flourishing afresh in the new frontier under the Kennedy administration. The series set for itself and its presumed audience an ethos of progressiveness, of equality compelled by constitutional law, and of the protection of individual rights against the prosecutorial state, all in a creative atmosphere unafraid of controversy. The soul of the Defenders was its ethical conscience. Conceived during the civil rights movement, it was also among the very first dramatic shows presenting African-American actors in significant roles, including Ossie Davis as a tough, recurring prosecutor. Notable in part for the fact that their characters were often cast colorblind, as they could have interchangeably been white. Through the medium of one-hour fictional drama, the Defenders visited terrain that in the 1960s pushed the envelope of both acceptable topicality and entertainment in a stream of episodes addressing subject matter that, even a half-century on, remains current. Euthanasia, post-traumatic stress disorder, parental custody, eminent domain, capital punishment, the execution of the innocent, sports fixing, defense of a fascist, child molestation, and abortion. And those topics were only in season 1. In subsequent years, its writers would deliver scripts on issues that would inspire 2 generations of their successors, giving voice to lawyers and clients on television: spousal abuse, hate crime, the decriminalization of narcotics, rehabilitation on death row, birth control, obscenity, teenage pregnancy, espionage, wiretapping, and over 100 others. Brodkin noted the following: the scripts will have the kind of substance not ordinarily found on television series. There will be presentations as the problems of a mixed marriage, a mercy killing, and a case of a young woman involved in hit and run. They will span the spectrum of human experience. From today's vantage point, however, there is a telling anomaly, a missing subject that remained taboo, as Reginald Rose acknowledged in 1962. Can any of you guess what subject they could never touch? What? You're close. Homosexuality. He says the series otherwise, he said that there are topics you can't touch, but he named only one: homosexuality. The series' otherwise courageous writing and producing team must have felt this to be a saddening, lingering constraint, as it would be one that would be outliving the show. The cultural impact of The Defenders was powerfully evidenced by the reaction to its more controversial topics. In the canon of its teleplays, several are cited by commentators as extraordinary milestones: Blacklist, about actors and red baiting, A Book for Burning, about obscenity, and Mad Men, about legal insanity, are frequently referenced in analyses of the series because of the quality of their scripts. But by far, the most controversial episode was in its first season, The Benefactor, about abortion, when its 3 mainstay sponsors, Kimberly-Clark, Lever Brothers, and Brown & Williamson Tobacco, as well as several affiliates, withdrew their support from an announced episode. And despite other substantial objections and pressure, CBS admirably authorized and broadcast it anyway, to critical acclaim and a vast audience. Little footnote, Speidel, the manufacturer of the famous Twistoflex watch band, was offered the time 10 cents on a dollar, and they bought the whole show. Can you run the clip? If you could turn down the lights, please. I'm just going to show you a client conference on that episode called The Benefactor.
Most people have strong feelings about one thing or another, but you let your feelings destroy your career and alter your whole life. Why?
My career seemed unimportant to me. There are hundreds of good orthopedists. I don't see what difference my motives can make.
They're all we have to present to a jury. I'm trying to prevent you from spending 5 years in prison.
I'm not looking to be saved. Don't you see that?
Then what do you want?
To be understood.
Then help me to understand you. Why did you do it? What made you battle the law all by yourself?
Because I believed in what I was doing. Somebody had to make safe, inexpensive abortions available for people who needed them.
Dr. Montgomery, I've thought about this a great deal, and I believe I'm right. Let me plead you guilty and throw you on the mercy of the court.
No! There are things to be said, aloud, in public. I want to be heard.
I understand your principles, but principles aren't admissible in a court of law. Only facts.
You're telling me I'm going to lose, aren't you? It doesn't matter. I expect to lose. I lost when I was caught. Mr. Preston, how are bad laws revised?
By legislative action.
And how's that action brought about?
Usually by the necessities of the times.
And by altered public opinion?
Yes.
Well, I want to see if I can alter public opinion. I want to see if I can help change the law on abortion. I was caught because I adhered to a principle. I want the facts to be known whether I win or lose. You can help me. Will you do it?
I'm not sure I approve of using the law as a forum rather than an instrument of justice.
There are all kinds of justice.
Yes, I suppose there are.
You can keep the lights down because I'm going to go quickly to another clip and then finish up. The echo of that show's theme is as resonant today as it was 40 years ago, and so powerful and enduring was its foreshadowing the law and politics of abortion that it served as a plot element in a second season episode of Mad Men, the AMC series set in the advertising world of Madison Avenue in 1962. Watch this clip. It's called Mad Men, the Benefactor. The episode, by the way, the Mad Men episode, was called The Benefactor.
CBS, please.
Hello?
Freddie, Harry Crane, how are you?
I'm still at work, same as you.
How do you like it over there?
Oh, did Sterling Coup lose some of its drunken luster?
I don't know. I was thinking maybe I have to move out to move up.
Oh, well, forget about here. They're picking us off. I'm one gone paleface.
Well, thought I'd ask. Keep your ear to the ground for me, will you? It doesn't have to be there.
Hey, how about some concern? I just lost Lever Brothers and Kimberly Clark from one of my biggest shows.
We're lousy with sponsors over here. What do you need?
Don't get excited. Sponsors drop out for a reason.
Not always.
Okay, try this on. The Defenders, top 20 show. E.G. Marshall, Bob Reed. Lawyers, but you know, they really care. So the writers turn in this script about a cannibal.
A cannibal lawyer?
The director eats up all this time, refusing to do it, like his resume isn't filled with crap. And surprise, the writers have only one other script ready. Something we threw away last year because they used the word abortion 30 times in 51 minutes.
Why?
Because they show one. Opening scene. Exactly. The whole thing was a ploy to get us to shoot it. They think they're so clever. No, I tell you, I missed a blacklist.
Send it over. I want to see it.
Sure. It's going on the air, sponsor or no. I'll watch it with you in the bar where I'll be working.
Send it over. Let me see what I can do.
All right.
In 1965, you can turn up the lights. Thank you. In 1965, after 132 episodes, the network decided upon a major overhaul of its primetime schedule, and the program's eventual cancellation was mourned. The Defenders is the direct ancestor of all modern lawyer series, with dense adult dialogue attentive to engrossing and accessible legal substance and procedure. It is the clear link between the shows that preceded it and those that followed. L.A. Law, Law and Order, The Practice, and their progeny would have been unthinkable without the Defenders. But perhaps its worthiest legacy is that it left those who watched it with a profound sense that there is honor, pride, and high ethical purpose in being a lawyer.
Now, Phil Meyer is going to discuss LA law. Title talk is Why LA Law Still Matters. Phil?
Several years ago, the ABA Bar Journal did a survey of the top programs about lawyers on television, and the #1 rated program of all time was LA Law. It was a program that I think mattered when it came on, and it still matters now, and I want to tell you a few of the reasons why. First, there's the cultural effect of the program, the cultural significance. And the second, something that hasn't been talked about before, the innovative narrative structure of the program. And third, the characters and the community, the constellation of characters at the law firm of Mackenzie Brackman. First, the cultural effect. Well, what do I mean? There's talk now in academic literature about something called the interpenetration of law and pop culture. That is, once upon a time, I think, academics studied popular culture primarily as a distorted representation of what goes on in practice. And I really, despite Chuck Rosenberg's comment, I really don't think this is the case any longer. Now, we look at something called the two-way traffic between law and popular culture. That is, popular culture, film and television, not only reflects what goes on in the law, but it creates what goes on in the law. It creates cultural notions of the law. It affects how law is actually practiced in a courtroom. And it also impacts on what goes on in the legal academy, in the classroom, and in scholarship. And let me tell you a story. In 1986, I left a firm in Connecticut to teach in the new lawyering program at NYU School of Law. And when I got there, and by the way, there was a spike in the applications at law schools during the years that LA Law came on the air. When I got there, I found that many of my students were addicted to LA Law. They watched LA Law like it was the light on the end of Gatsby's Daisy's dock, and they were like Gatsby across the bay. They looked on what was on the other side with lust and longing. They wanted to be heroic like Michael Cusack, or they wanted to preserve their values like Victor Cifuentes, but most especially in the greed is good 1980s, they wanted to drive a Porsche Targa and to be shrewd and cynical and knowing in their practices. But the impact of LA Law was a lot deeper than this. LA Law was the first program that was taken seriously as a teaching tool in law schools. Steve Gillers used episodes of LA Law to teach ethics. I mean, instead of cases or to supplement cases. I used clips from LA Law, usually closing arguments, in my lawyering class to teach students how to take complex facts and translate them into stories that would play upon a jury. And also, I don't think it's coincidental that there was a rise in the interest in law and pop culture during the years that LA Law was on. There were the initial symposia on law and popular culture, including the Yale Symposia that featured articles like Taking LA Law Seriously. Now, second, I want to talk about the narrative structure, something that hasn't been talked about before. LA Law had a really innovative narrative structure. It paired together what seems to be disparate and discordant narrative forms. First of all, there's traditional heroic lawyer melodrama, the Michael Cusack stories, the Ann Kelsey stories, the Victor Cifuentes stories. That's where a heroic lawyer comes into town and rides to the rescue of a client or another third party, and in the process it defeats a villain, often a lawyer on the other side, but not necessarily, and achieves justice in the end. This is Perry Mason revisited in the 1980s. A little bit more ambivalent hero, but the same format, linear protagonist-driven melodrama. It takes that, and it makes a great move. It pairs it with a Paddy Chayefsky-like black comedy. Something that Paddy Chayefsky could have written in the 50s for television or in the 60s in movies like Hospital or Network. That is comedy as a form of dark social critique. Critique of the values and the world of upper-class Los Angeles in the Greed is Good 1980s, and also a deep and knowing critique of the lawyers who serve these clients. And strangely enough, you would think that these two narrative strands would repel each other, but they don't. They braid together and they form something very interesting. 1 and 1 doesn't equal 2 exactly, it equals 3. And this format, I think, became the prototype for the most successful programs on television at the end of the 20th century, programs like The Sopranos. Now, the third way that LA law matters, and this is, to me, recalls my practice most vividly, is in terms of the constellation of characters in the community of Mackenzie Brackman. And I'm going to focus on one character, Arnie Becker, the divorce lawyer, who is so much like the partner that I worked for in my law firm, a fellow named, his friends called him Buffalo Bob Slavitt, but his enemies, I won't even tell you what they called him. And he had a client line out the door of women who wanted to seek revenge upon their husbands. He wasn't sexually predatory like Arnie Becker, but his mind worked in the same way. Again, I find it to be, Arnie does capture that almost Jungian archetypal energy. First, Arnie and Bob were both incredibly shrewd men. They knew the game of lawyering, and they were great players of it. They knew how to win. But secondly, they were curiously literary people. They were deeply intuitive folks who could look into the hearts and minds of clients and attorneys and the players in legal dramas, and seemingly they would know what was going on and how to work people, how to play people. Secondly, both are incredibly arrogant. They believe that not only do they have insight, but that they can manipulate people as if they're the human actors on a legal chessboard to win a game of victory. It's beyond hubris. And the third way that they're alike is, in the language of the 1980s, they have the capacity to what's called going meta. That is, to step outside of their experiences and comment upon those experiences and the stories that they're engaged in from an ironic remove. And that, to me, is their most endearing quality because it's such a literary quality. So I want to play a clip of Arnie in action. Arnie represents the client Lydia, his client Lydia, and Lydia wants a peaceful divorce. And Arnie has gone out and hired a private investigator without Lydia's permission. And the private investigator has dug up a lot of dirt on Lydia's husband. Lydia's husband is not only a philanderer, but he's a crook. And pushing against Lydia's wishes, Arnie has employed this ammunition to extract an economically favorable divorce settlement. This is the end of the settlement conference and the slight coda that appears afterward when Lydia realizes that Arnie has fundamentally destroyed her relationship with her husband, her soon-to-be ex-husband, forever. And can you turn down the lights? This is the wrong clip. This is Victor Cifuentes. That's not it.
Is it forward or back?
Here.
You'd better be prepared to defend yourself in a slander suit, sir.
As I recall, truth is a complete defense. I have here a signed and notarized affidavit from one of our private investigators, Ms. Angela Cipriano, stating that on such and such a day, blah, 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 blah. She drove onto your premises to discuss repairs of her badly damaged automobile. At which time, after carefully inspecting said damages, Mr. Barry Graham personally proposed in exchange for a cash payment that he would...
Let's see that.
If you can prove any of this, why don't you go to the police?
Hold it, just a minute. What are we talking about here?
Talking about grief, Mr. Graham. Yours, your wife's, your children's. We're talking about fairness. But mainly, Mr. Graham, we're talking about money.
How much money?
Chew on those numbers, you impotent piece of snot.
Brock, I want to type this up. Let's messenger it up to Glazer for his and Mr. Graham's signature, okay?
Right away. Can I get you anything, Mrs. Graham? Glass of wine? Coffee? A new tissue? I'm fine, thank you.
Well, I guess we socked it to him pretty good, huh?
I think what you did was despicable. I'll never be able to look at him again with any kind of respect or affection.
Lydia, you came in here looking for somebody to do your dirty laundry. What'd you expect?
Well, it stinks.
Well, dirty laundry usually does. It's messy and it's nasty and it churns up a whole lot of goo, but it's a hell of a lot more civilized and a hell of a lot more lucrative than putting a bullet between his ears.
It's all so easy for you. Just sock it to him and get the money. Well, I lost my life. My children lost a family. And there's no amount of money that would compensate for that.
You gonna give it back? Lydia, maybe you hate me today. That's understandable. But 2 weeks from now, you're gonna be recommending me to a friend. 2 months from now, you'll be inviting me over for dinner.
Okay, cut it. Cut it. Okay, that's it. Well, that's it. So I think that LA Law is a program that matters. It mattered when it came out, and it matters a lot now. And fortunately or unfortunately, at least in the dark comedic versions, just like Patty Chayefsky writing Hospital or Network or for television in years before, it's a program that matters because it says a lot about the practice of law, who we are as lawyers, and what we in fact do.
Shannon Mader's talk is going to be about law and order, particularly about the Defense Council on Law and Order. Shannon?
Thank you. I want to start my talk today with a quote from America's most famous lawyer, President Obama, announcing Sunday night that American military forces had killed Osama bin Laden. President Obama said, "Justice had been done." That's an interesting choice of words in light of our conference today. No court of law was involved in the decision to kill Osama bin Laden. No judge, jury rendered a verdict. No lawyers had an opportunity to argue or present evidence. In short, no criminal justice system of any kind, American or international, appears to have been involved. Yet, President Obama said justice had been done. And it is, I think, a sentiment we would all agree with. Nonetheless, it is a remarkable statement in many ways. It is almost impossible to imagine Jimmy Carter having said those words. It's almost equally impossible to imagine Michael Dukakis having said them. But one can imagine Bill Clinton having said them, and obviously Barack Obama just did. What happened between Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton and Michael Dukakis and Barack Obama is that American liberalism changed from what scholars have variously described as legal liberalism or rights-based liberalism to what I called in my essay in Lawyers in the Living Room, tough guy liberalism. That's not a very satisfying term intellectually, but I think it actually accurately captures the essence of this transformation on issues from the death penalty to military force to welfare reform. Tough guy liberalism adopted positions and rhetoric calculated to convey images of toughness and hard-headedness. In my essay in Law and Order, in Lawyers in the Living Room, I argued that Law and Order epitomized this transformation by recasting the criminal prosecutor, frequently the villain or the foil in liberal television and movie dramas of the 60s and 70s, as a role model of sorts for this new generation of liberals. Fundamentally liberal in their political outlook, yet unambiguously committed to the prosecution of lawbreakers without always the strictest regard for legal niceties, and largely immune to arguments based on economic, social, or psychological roots of criminal conduct. Ben Stone and Jack McCoy personify, in different ways, the politics of tough guy liberalism. The recasting of the criminal prosecutor as a liberal hero, however, raises questions as to what role the criminal defense attorney, traditionally the hero in liberal legal movies and television shows, plays in this new fictional world of tough guy liberalism. Hence the subject of my talk today, the treatment of the criminal defense attorneys in Law and Order. Now, generalizing about their treatment is fraught with peril, obviously, because although there were a handful of recurring criminal defense attorneys, generally it's a different defense attorney every week, and many episodes had many different criminal defense attorneys. So there's not one small set of characters to hone in on like there is with the prosecutors. But I think some generalizations are possible. First, criminal defense attorneys in the show serve a consistent narrative function. They make life difficult for the prosecution. That's a seemingly obvious point, but a critical one. In television shows that focus on criminal defense attorneys, the narrative function of the criminal defense attorney is to prove the innocence of the accused. That's the character's goal, and that's the narrative thrust. But in Law and Order, the narrative thrust of the show is the apprehension and conviction of the accused. And criminal defense attorneys function as obstacles. They stand in the way of that goal. Second, despite the variety, the criminal defense lawyers in Law and Order tend to fall into several basic categories or type, at least in my view. First, there are what I call the hired guns. These are the criminal defense lawyers who represent well-heeled clients and who are doing their job primarily for the money. Frequently, they're characterized as big firm or Wall Street lawyers. Sometimes, before they introduce the character, they'll have the heading at the bottom of the screen, and it'll give a Wall Street address, Park Avenue address, or something like that. But they're not always from big firms. Sometimes they're solo practitioners, sometimes small, medium-sized firms. But what they have in common is their clients have money, and they probably wouldn't be representing them if they didn't. For instance, in the episode Prince of Darkness, a particularly sinister hitman for the Colombian drug cartel is represented by a character named Chris Minetti, an obvious mob lawyer, whose credo, according to Paul Robinette, is innocent until proven broke. But not all hired guns in the show are sleazy. In fact, most of the hired guns are depicted as generally well-respected and more or less ethical. Take, for instance, George Grizzard's recurring character, Arthur Gold. Although kind of slick and a bit smarmy and maybe a bit superficial, Ben Stone in one episode calls him all fizz and no gin. Gold is not portrayed as a completely sleazy character, or he lacks passion, though, and he is not acting on principle. At the opposite end of the spectrum from the hired gun are the crusaders. These are traditionally the heroes in liberal television shows and dramas about lawyers. In Law and Order, they can be public defenders, public interest lawyers, solo practitioners. What they have in common is they see their cases through ideological prisms, or attempt to inject ideological issues, highly charged ones, into the case, or exploit those issues for purposes of defending their client. Frequently, they take the cases because they believe in those causes, and they want to push to change the law or to bring attention to the causes they believe in. In other cases, however, they are just lawyers who realize this is a case that they can use. If they use this issue, it may help their case, and there's not a lot of other good facts in the case. So they're not consistently portrayed. But generally, they are true believers, not always. Like I said, sometimes they're doing it because they think it's the best defense for the client. Examples of the Crusader include Shambhala Green. She appeared in many episodes, played by Lorraine Toussaint. Gary Lowenthal, played by Eric Bogosian in several episodes. Jerome Osborne, played by Samuel Wright. Mildred Caskell, played by Joyce Reeling, and actually William Kunstler himself shows up. In one episode, Blue Bamboo, the character of Mildred Caskell is typecast immediately as a crusader the moment she walks into McCoy's office. Upon learning that she is taking over the defense of a white woman accused of murdering and robbing a Japanese man in a hotel room, McCoy cracks, "I know your work, Miss Caskell, so what's it going to be, the feminist version of The Devil Made Me Do It?" A third category of criminal defense lawyers is what I call the 9-to-5ers. These are public defenders or solo practitioners whose credo is basically, it's a living. They harbor no illusions of grandeur, whether personal or ideological. They know they're not going to change the world. They know they're not going to get rich. They've been around the block, don't particularly like the block, and want to get around it as quickly as possible the next time. They're typically portrayed as cynical, fast-talking, hard-bitten. Generally, they are very competent, although sometimes they are also lazy and incompetent. But even the competent ones know that competence only gets you so far when your client's fingerprints are on the murder weapon. Examples of the 9-to-5er include Sally Knight, who's played by Mary Mara, and Sally Bell, played by Edie Falco. And the fourth category that I've come up with is a relatively small but a memorable one, the pro se defendants. The pro se defendants are crusaders too, but their crusades are generally themselves. Sometimes they try to make a larger social or economic point, but their focus is primarily on their own situation. This is what distinguishes them from the crusaders. The crusaders see the client through the lens of a larger issue. The pro se defendant sees the larger issue, if at all, only through their lens of their own situation. Sometimes they're cranks, but not always. In fact, a surprising number of them in the show are actually lawyers or went to law school. In other cases, there's a lot of pretend lawyers or people who pretended to go to law school. But the irony, surprisingly, in the show is it has a somewhat populist representation of these characters, and they frequently tend to be portrayed as better than the other real lawyers portrayed in the show. Typical examples include Philip Swan, played by, he's virtually ubiquitous in TVs these days, I have a hard time pronouncing his first name, Zelcho Ivanek. Susan Boyd, played by Frances Fisher, and James Smith, played by Dennis O'Hare. Now, the third generalization I'd make is that despite my somewhat pejorative terminology, Law & Order does not portray the types or categories that I've described as intrinsically bad or good. Like the prosecutors in the show, like the judges in the show, there are good and bad ones within each of the types I discuss. Take, for instance, the category of the crusader. There are clearly crusaders that the show portrays in a negative light. For instance, there's one episode, Competence, that deals with a shooting involving Detective Van Buren. She shoots a young boy, African-American boy, who accosted her at an ATM. There was another boy at that same scene who the prosecutors then begin to focus on. That boy is represented by an African-American attorney who, during one meeting with McCoy, threatens to incite racial flames if his client is prosecuted. He tells McCoy, "Ice cream, babe, ice cream, burn, baby, burn," and something somewhere goes up in smoke. It's not a particularly believable exchange, but it reflects the show's attitude towards the two crusaders who would reflexively inject highly charged issues into cases where, in the show's view, or in McCoy's view, or Stone's view, they really don't belong. But there are also crusaders who are portrayed in more positive terms. Portrayed as something between, a case in point is Lainey Stieglitz, portrayed by Elaine Stritch in the episode Point of View. Portrayed as something between something of a cross between Bella Abzug, Betty Friedan, and Phyllis Diller. Stieglitz is an unreconstructed second-wave feminist who takes on the case as a woman who is accused of killing a man outside of a bar. Stieglitz's defense is that the woman killed the man because she thought the man was going to rape her. It turns out the woman was killing the man on orders from an Irish mobster who had previously knocked off the woman's husband, abusive husband. But with the trials going poorly, and Stone and Robinette discuss whether they need to tell Stieglitz this, because obviously she's unaware of the truth about her client. Stone acknowledges that Lainey is a true believer, but he concludes she would want to do the right thing. So he tells her and warns her that if she puts the client on the stand, she'd be suborning perjury. Stieglitz pauses and replies, "Well, maybe the principle's worth it." But the next day in Stone's office, in front of Stone, Stieglitz tells the client, "I cannot and will not perpetrate a fraud in the court. It's unethical and illegal. I'm not going to put you on the stand tomorrow, Mary. and I'm not going to make a closing argument, and the jury is going to wonder why. Not given the option of retaining new counsel, the client reluctantly takes a deal from Stone, even though she says she thinks she would have been acquitted, and fingers the Irish mobster who was last seen getting hauled away by the police. In the world of Law & Order, it's clearly a happy ending. The criminal defense attorney does the right thing, as Stone puts it, and the guilty parties go to jail. In reality, of course, it is far from clear that what Stieglitz did was the right thing as a matter of legal ethics. But the show tries to give a legal ethics gloss to what she does. But it's clear that really what makes Stieglitz good in the view of the show, a good crusader in the view of the show, is that she wouldn't allow her cause, protecting the rights of would-be rape victims, to be used in the service of a woman who was not a would-be rape victim. Now, there are also good and bad 9-to-5ers. One of the good ones is Sally Bell, played by Edie Falco. Her character shows up in several episodes, but I want to focus on one called Swindlers. Swindlers deals with the murder of a lawyer, and lawyers are frequently victims in the show, named Lipinski, who, as one character puts it, was swindling people who had already been swindled. Lipinski was retained by the victims of a savings and loan executive who was jailed for swindling millions of victims. And Lipinski told his clients, look, I think I know where he has his money hidden away. Give me some time, and I'm going to track it down, and I'll get it for you. Lipinski is later found murdered. Suspicion initially falls on the son of one of his elderly clients. The prosecution's theory is that the son found out that Lipinski was telling basically a BS story, and he killed him because Lipinski wouldn't give back the check that his mother had given Lipinski. The theory falls apart in mid-trial when Sally Bell establishes through testimony that Lipinski returned the check. So the prosecution has to come up with a new motive. After some additional investigative work, the prosecution learns that Lipinski had in fact tracked down the money but had reached a deal with the savings and loan executive to basically take money from him, extorted money from him in exchange for kind of stalling his clients. And in the end, they put behind bars both the defendant, the original defendant, and the savings and loan executive. In the world of Law and Order, Sally Bell is a good 9-to-5er because she made the prosecution work harder, not by getting evidence suppressed on a technicality, but by bringing out evidence that clearly undermined the prosecution's theory. Now there's bad 9-to-5ers too. There's a memorable episode involving a character named Sally Knight in Right to Counsel. She's a cynical, fast-talking, let's-make-a-deal defense attorney. There's a wealthy heiress murdered. She represents the original defendant, who's a middle-aged, hard-up fashion designer. Very quickly, she cops a deal for this guy and moves on. Robinette is suspicious, so he investigates, finds out that the attorney was referred, had the case referred to her by the trust attorney for the victim. And he thinks that's odd. It actually turns out that she went to law school with the trust attorney, Brooklyn Law, and then she had a very unsuccessful legal career. Robinette talks to Stone about it. Stone doesn't believe it at first, but then Stone confronts Knight. She dismisses his concerns with wisecracks like, I've heard it all before, I can't afford to think too much. In the end, however, Knight admits that the trust attorney referred to the case and told her to plead the defendant out and not to think about it too much. So therefore, Knight is a bad defense attorney, 9-to-5er, because basically she didn't make the prosecution work hard. Now there's hired gun characters too. One of the most memorable is Paul Capel. He's a mob lawyer and law school friend of McCoy who turns out to be more than just a lawyer to his clients. He actually is revealed to be participating in business meetings with the mobsters, participating in meetings where crimes are committed. He actually creates a jury questionnaire that elicits information that they use then to bribe witnesses. And McCoy says to him, like, how can you get in bed with your clients? You can defend them without getting in bed. He says, no, that's where you're wrong. I got to think like he does, do as he does. I got to become him. It's the only way I can go into court and fight for him with any passion at all. That's what makes the system work. Later, in an opening statement to the jury, Capel gives his view of the role of the defense attorney. When a defense attorney steps into a courtroom and does everything in his power to poke holes in the prosecutor's case and still fails, the chance that an innocent man may be convicted is nil. The character of Paul Capel is fascinating because he turns the hired gun character inside and out. While he's still doing it for the money, he recognizes he can't do his job if he can't be passionate about defending the clients as much as the prosecution is about convicting them. So he becomes his client. He's also fascinating because he's a criminal defense attorney who basically articulates a view of defense attorneys that essentially prosecution-centric. he views criminal defense attorneys as essentially assuring that the prosecution gets the right guy. It's a somewhat disingenuous argument for him to make, but I think it actually sums up the show's view. And that's the thesis I want to put forward. And that is that the narrative function of defense lawyers in Law and Order is not just the narrative function. It's their, in Law and Order's worldview, it's their structural and moral function, which is to make life difficult for the tough guy liberal to prosecute people. To rights-based liberals, the function of the criminal defense attorney is to ensure the rights of the accused are protected, which frequently means getting people evidence suppressed on infractions of those rights, even if they're technical. Guilt or innocence is largely irrelevant. For the tough guy liberal, though, guilt in a sense is the fundamental question. In a phrase, justice should be done. Procedure is a means to an end, but not an end. So in the end, there's a great irony to Law and Order's depiction of criminal defense lawyers, and is this: that by relegating the characters of the criminal defense attorney to a secondary role in which he or she functions essentially as a narrative obstacle that the prosecutor must overcome, Law and Order actually does justice, a rough justice, to the vision of rights-based liberalism by making the defense of the accused a means, not an end.
We're going to open this up to questions now. If people would like to go to either of those microphones and ask the question. In the meantime, I think I'll try to re-raise the issue I mentioned at the beginning. How about in things like the Defenders or Harry's Law or LA Law or Law and Order? How much of you think really is a reasonably accurate portrayal of the legal system, and how much it really is more entertainment value or character studies? Which would run the line? You want to start there?
Yeah, I think the Defenders did its best to really try to be an accurate portrayal of the legal system, but subject to the constraints that we talked about this morning of drama and the practicalities of being in television with 4 breaks. But apropos, when I was doing my research, to your question, I actually went into because it's not available on video. It's hard to find episodes, but there's an archive of original scripts at the Special Collections of UCLA, and I found this. It's just a couple of sentences. This is on the front page, just where you see the title of the episode. It'll say whatever it is, the writer, but it says this: "Note to director: no changes of any kind are to be made in portions of the script which involve legalities without first consulting Bob Markell, producer, Reginald Rose, or David Shaw. This is extremely important." And then it says this: "If none of these people can be reached, contact our legal consultant, Jerome Leitner," and he gives his private phone number, Madison, and I won't give the digits. Anyway, Jerome Leitner, by the way, was Reginald Rose's private lawyer. Right on the first page of each script was at least the attempt that once a decision had been made to portray the legalities within a fair framework of what they really were at the time in New York State, that it couldn't be changed.
All right, that's good. Michael?
Well, as people pointed out this morning, we're talking about commercial entertainment here and not documentaries, and we should never expect that legal shows are going to be authentic or accurate in detail. And I like what someone's already quoted you, Chuck, for something which I think Paul Bergman did, which is that we hope that the shows pursue a bigger truth. If they're truthful in a big sense about what lawyers do and about the legal issues that are covered, that's all we can expect, and that's all we should really want. And I think many of them, not what I regard as silly ones like Ally McBeal, but sincere ones that really try to do a good job, they do achieve this.
I think it's a false dichotomy between reality and entertainment. I don't think that's the nature of the split. I think there's documentaries, and then there's something that's beyond, a step above entertainment, and that's art that tries to capture a certain sense of truthfulness. And that's what I was saying, with Paddy Chayefsky, for example. He really did capture the reality of a hospital or the reality of the media in almost in anticipation of what was revealed later on with reality TV. He saw it 15 years before. And the same thing can be said of LA Law in its finer moments, and in those black Arnie Becker subplots, they actually do, to me, capture some truthfulness about the nature of practice that goes beyond facticity. And I think that's the nature of what art's about. Now, I also think there is a certain type of art that is both factually meticulous and truthful, and I actually think that's some of the best work that lawyers do. I've worked a bit with Tony Amsterdam, and I read his briefs, and when he tells the story of his clients, they're both factually meticulous and truthful, and that, to me, claims a certain sense of art. And I think it's the rare television program that does that, that reaches those goals. But they're just moments and glimmers, and there are moments and glimmers in LA Law of something that's a step above popular entertainment, which to me is often just background noise.
Good. Shannon?
Well, I'm at a disadvantage in that I'm not a criminal defense lawyer or a criminal prosecutor, so it's hard to judge exactly for Law and Order. I have an interesting anecdote, though. When I did, years ago, I interviewed with a Third Circuit federal judge who was a former high-level prosecutor in the Justice Department for many years, and he went on to actually head the Homeland Security Department under President Bush. And he saw that I had my resume that I wrote a book on law and popular culture, or co-authored a book on that, and he asked me my favorite legal TV show, and I said, well, it's probably Law and Order, and he said, he just looked at me, and I could tell I had lost, the interview was over at that point. He looked at me and he said, it's just ridiculous, and then moved on. So apparently in his view, the show was absolutely, there's no reality to whatsoever. I mean, later on he went back to it and said like that, something about how these are all obvious legal issues in any criminal case, and they act like it's high drama, there's a motion filed and things like this. But in any event, I mean, he wasn't nitpicking about the cases they cite, because Law and Order actually says cases in almost every episode, and frequently they cite cases and mention cases, although if you really went to law school, I mean, if you were recently out of law school, you probably know that the cases are all, a lot of them are very well known and would be obvious to any criminal defense lawyer. But in any event, it's hard for me to judge on that basis, but I have talked to other prosecutors, and generally the view is it's not particularly realistic. But,
John, can I just add one sentence? I am reminded that when the earlier discussion arose that Dean Acheson, sort of in 1947 or 48, said, with respect to international diplomacy and potential lying by the government, he said, you know, sometimes it's necessary to make things clearer than the truth.
Meaning lies.
He said what he said.
Right. Sir? Yeah.
I just had a part observation, part question. I have to tell you, I'm a retired prosecutor, and my wife is still working in the office. And for years, we had the cop movies where the cops would go catch the crooks and wouldn't pick up a single piece of evidence. All right? And then we had the defense attorney shows, and this panel has gone through a number of those and talked about how, you know, they were important over time. And then finally, we have a program, Law and Order, which somewhat tells it from the prosecution point of view, although our panelists here seem to want to talk about it from the defense attorney point of view. And I would submit that maybe that's the real importance of Law and Order, is that there's finally a program that shows it from the prosecution point of view. It's not very realistic. I mean, I can't really watch much, but my wife still watches it, but I really can't take it. But at least, you know, at least it shows it somewhat from our point of view. And I would submit, frankly, there's every bit as much drama from the prosecution side of the law as there is from the defense.
Actually, I want to say something. There was an earlier TV show that Law and Order is partly modeled on, Arrest and Trial, and from the 1960s that had the same exact format, except with a twist. It starts with the police apprehending somebody, but then it shifts to the defense. And the second half of the story is then the defense attorneys. And so it's an odd, after being used to Law and Order, it's an odd structure to see. But what's very interesting is it was made during the heyday of kind of the liberal TV dramas, and it has the police are actually very socially conscious and things, and the show is basically rooting kind of to have the person, if they're prosecuted, they at least are rehabilitated in some way, or they've gotten off in some way, but it's a very odd show to watch now in light of Law and Order.
You know, I've always thought that Law and Order might be based more on Dragnet.
It's a police procedural in part, obviously.
Yeah. But it brings in a lot of interesting offbeat characters, you know, on the suspects and everything, you know. So it's kind of, it really is not so much about the law as basically as a way to showcase a lot of interesting.
Well, certainly the other shows in the series have, criminal intent and special victims shifted away from the law and went to more of the investigation. Although they tried to do trial by jury, which was just the trial, but it wasn't very successful. And they also had one, I believe, called Conviction, which is loosely connected to the franchise.
You know, there was another quite good recent show called Shark, starring James Woods, which is also from a prosecution standpoint, and showed, you know, prosecutors as being worthy people who were really trying to put bad guys away. Now, the ethics of the prosecutors on Shark are way, way below the level of the ethics on Law and Order. But nevertheless, it does indicate that in the modern age now, much less liberal perhaps than previous ones, there is a role for prosecutors. And of course, police dramas, which are about catching the crooks, are endlessly popular. So I think they're getting a fair shake.
I'd like to get into a question now about exactly, you know, what do you think these shows really have on the promotion of the rule of law values that we value as a society? You think in the long run that these are basically undermining those, or they're making people believe more in the courts and the legal system actually operate well to produce justice?
Well, I think they very much promote the rule of law. As Paula Bergman said this morning, jury trials are vastly more common on television than they are in real life. But what you see on all these shows, whether they're defense-oriented or prosecution-oriented, is justice being done through the adversary system of people, of good lawyers fighting it out and thus achieving truth. And I think that's an enormous plus.
But to play devil's advocate, I mean, aren't they, if you show what happens only 1% of the time in reality is happening all the time on television, basically, are you really promoting the rule of law, or are you just basically making up a fantasy system where the rule of law is protected?
It's aspirational.
Yeah, of course.
It's aspirational. It's
no question. We never can compare televised drama to real life. You just can't do that. It's not intended for that purpose. But the statement that is being made and the cultural impact is that this adversary system really works. I think far better than any of us actually think it works in reality.
I think, can I just say one thing? In Law and Order, at least, it certainly subscribes to the view that the adversarial system does produce absolute truth. Even if the prosecution has the wrong guy initially, they eventually sort it out and get the right guy. However, these shows, Law and Order, has a continuing dialogue on these issues, where they have episodes that isn't true to try and bring up the other's point of view. Where there's episodes where it ends with it cannot be proven for sure. There are not many, but there are episodes like that.
Mr. Rosenberg, yeah.
You know, it really, I've observed there are only 2
John, how about you use the mic, because we're videotaping.
With a few rare exceptions, there are only 2 plots in legal shows. One is the innocent person is about to be convicted but gets off. Perry Mason is a classic example of that. The other one is the innocent person, which is a little more rare. The innocent person, the guilty person is about to go free, but is found out in the end and doesn't go free. And I think if you look at those, that does suggest that the justice system works. But one of the questions I haven't watched enough CSI to know whether they have episodes in which the forensic evidence shows that someone is not guilty, because certainly one of the things that the Innocence Project has promoted is that there are lots of false positives in the criminal justice system with regard to capital cases, and therefore you have to wonder how many there are with regard to cases in which people don't spend as much money that aren't capital crimes on either side. And I don't know whether CSI does that or not. It would be interesting to know.
I'd like to get into something on the fantasy side. As I guess our last question I'll throw out to the panel is, this morning people talked about 2 types of non-legal values which are promoted. One is the idea of kind of personal fulfillment. You might say Ally McBeal or even LA Law. People can identify with glamorous people and glamorous surroundings, leading interesting lives. The other one, basically, that people talked about was that actually that these shows quite often show a form of social criticism, right? They bring up, I thought that David Kelley said is that quite often in Boston Legal, they'd throw out an issue and at least, bring it into the public attention. So it was kind of a covert thing. Do you think that that's a defense for shows, is that they're able to play a political role?
I think that sometimes television, one thing where I have some issues with television, it repackages nuanced and difficult social issues into ways that are translatable into a commercially marketable product. And when the ex-prosecutor was talking about a show that incorporated the perspective of a prosecutor, or LA Law that incorporates a playful critique of upper classes in Los Angeles that we can all relate to, what's excluded systematically are certain perspectives of disenfranchised groups. You'll never find a commercial program, going back to Richard Pryor's line, there's justice and then there's just us, about African Americans warehoused in prison it wouldn't play well on television, and neither would the reality program about that subject, because it's not commercial. And I think both in the sense of justice and in the television melodramas, there has to be commerciality, that people either love it for entertainment, or it reflects positively on their values, or it is a gentle critique of their lives. And television never seems to cross those lines, unfortunately.
All right. Well, I think we'll have to stop there. I want to thank the panel for very interesting presentations, and thank you.